Okay, excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Ooh. Okay, can everyone see this? Does it look good? All right, so we'll go ahead and just get started. That's interesting. My slide is not progressing. Let me try that again. Okay, here we go. So feedback cycles abound across the curriculum and in professional life, but students often perceive feedback as isolated incidents that occur in distinct disciplinary settings, like maybe an English class. In the image that we see in front of us, there is no pattern. There are all of these individual colored dots, and we might imagine a student moving from class to class, from one colored dot to the next, erratic, disconnected, untethered, traveling from island to island. So what would happen if we taught students to see patterns in their feedback? What if we thought about the principles that govern feedback across contexts? This line of thinking is relevant for one of the students highlighted in Nancy Summers' article, Across the Drafts, named Jackson. Summers writes that Jackson sees no way to transport lessons from one paper to the next and therefore, quote, reads his instructor's comments as isolated moments in his college writing career, not as bridges between assignments, end quote. And she concludes, even the best, most thoughtful comments will not move a student like Jackson forward as writers. So here we see another image. The dots are really united by this pattern, by motion and movement. If the first image was an experience with feedback as an island, here the feedback is more like a current, pushing a student along an invisible path. In our conversations about feedback, we found that it is psychological, developmental, relational. It's also as common as water in the everyday sea of teaching and learning. So in this presentation, we want to think about how to connect our feedback in order to better serve our students. And our goal is that students will see patterns, and better yet, that they will learn how to receive feedback, a kind of posture of openness that will enable them to move in the direction that they choose. Hang on, Carolyn. Carolyn, yeah.
That is a rookie mistake, yet I am not a rookie. We come to this presentation from 4 disciplinary perspectives: English, speech, nursing, and mathematics. We all work together at Indiana University East. And last year, we read portions of John Bean's Engaging Ideas, as well as Across the Drafts by Nancy Summers. Certain lines from those resources stood out to us.
So here is our first assignment for you. These are quotations that we found were important to us as we were reading the literature. And I'd like to give everybody maybe 30 seconds or so to read those and then share with us in the chat which one is most salient to you and why. And by the way, this doc, oh, no. So one comment from Stephanie's earlier is about the feed forward that the English department or composition department has implemented. Are there any other ideas that come to mind as you see these comments? So the central quote sticks out to Sarah. And she's thinking about agency of the students. Ashley talks about comments anchoring students. And Sarah Austin about open disposition to feedback. All right. Student is a dialogue. I think that's a very good one. Okay. Are there any more? Socializing through engagement. Hmm? So feedback as a dialogue, that seems to be, touching. That seems to be a common recurrence. Okay.
Should we maybe scooch ahead?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so how can we teach students to be willing to accept and benefit from critical feedback? And how can we teach them to ride the feedback rather than be intimidated by it? To see it as connective, energetic, active, engaged, a force that can move them somewhere, a force that can result in something new ideas, new options for the future, new clarity about core concepts, and new ways to contribute and engage in the world.
I'm sorry if you can hear my daughter. I don't know how to mute myself while sharing my screen. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and transition to our teaching demonstration now, which we hope will present one way to kind of expansively frame feedback to get to the commenter about the meaningful writing project on expansive framing. So on the left here is children's book editor Ursula Nordstrom, who worked at Harper and Row from 1940s to the 1980s. You might not have heard of Ursula Nordstrom, but you've probably heard of some of the books that she's edited. Charlotte's Web, Goodnight Moon, Harriet the Spy, Freaky Friday, Where the Wild Things Are. This is actually not even a complete list of all of these wonderful books. So we're going to guide you through an exercise using a primary document from Ursula Nordstrom. And a handout is also available on the Whova page for our session, but you don't need it because all the text that you'll need will be here on the screen. If you want to download the handout though, then you can make the text a little bigger. So we're gonna go ahead and give you a few minutes to take a look at this letter from Ursula Nordstrom, which I have here, and ask you to kind of play detective as we read this letter together, looking for some clues about the situation that surrounded the writing of the letter.
So
At this time, I would like 6 volunteers to type their name in the chat box if they're interested in being willing to serve as a popcorn reader. Popcorn reading, of course, is when a group goes through a text together with each reader only reading a limited amount. So in our case, each reader will only read 1 paragraph. And Markus will check the chat box and put the order of the readers together. And when we have enough volunteers, we will begin. But remember, you will only be tasked with reading a small portion. Additionally, Markus will share the letter as a Word document through the chat.
well, actually, we found out this doesn't work quite as easily. So the document is in the app as a handout.
Okay.
So my apologies. I thought we could make that work easily.
Put it in front of us as well. So that's wonderful.
So who's a volunteer?
Okay. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Dear John, thanks for sending me the carbon copy of your manuscript. I'm glad to have this as I want to reread the book myself, and I also want Charlotte Zoloto to read it.
Debbie is next.
I hope that when you went over the original copy of the manuscript, you found that some of my marginal notations made sense. As I said at luncheon, I think that not all places marked need work, but if you do some of them, give the actual conversations in some of them, the other parts will seem perfectly all right.
I know you don't want to hit your readers over their heads, but we do think you can make it clearer, more vivid, that David does suffer from considerable worry and guilt feelings. I completely missed the fact that you meant his seeming casualness to be bravado.
Okay, we need more volunteers.
And then the final talk with the father needed work, needed deepening and broadening. We can talk about this, but I should also tell you how really excellent, but I should also tell you how really excellent so much of it is. I put complimentary remarks in the margins too, as I hope you noticed. It is so well written and all the school stuff is so good, and the friendship with the little boy on the bus. Perhaps we hear just a bit too much about the mother's drinking, but I want to reread it. As I said, I read it in one swift gulp my first evening back after vacation.
Do we have another volunteer for the next paragraph?
I
I'll
hope
read.
you will do the necessary work on it pretty soon, John. I don't want to even try to rush you, but we'd like to have the manuscript in final form well before you leave in September. And I want to be sure that when you are ready to let me see it again, it comes at a time when I can drop everything else and read it immediately. So keep in touch, will you? As you see how work goes. As I said at luncheon, we're going to meet a lot of resistance on this book, and we will be eager to fight that resistance as intelligibly and gracefully as possible.
Volunteer for the last paragraph.
I was so glad to gather from everything you said that you want to make it the very best book it can be. This letter is growing stuffier with every word I type, so no more for now. But I'm very glad you wanted to write this book, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity to publish it. I think it is going to mean a lot to a lot of young readers if we can just get it past the adults who buy their books.
Great, thank you. So I like reading that nice and slowly. Oops, why is this not going? Okay. So let's see if we can answer some of these questions. I asked you guys to think about yourselves as detectives. This is the same thing we would do with students who are reading the letter, by the way. So if you want to shout out or just drop into the chat, why was Nordstrom writing the letter? And what did she want John to do? Mm-hmm. She wanted some revisions, says Michael. Mm-hmm. She said she wants to encourage him to keep working, says Brianna. Mm-hmm. Maybe avoiding or procrastinating, says Heidi. Debbie says praise, but also revision. That's right. That's right. Now you guys are at a little bit of a disadvantage because I would typically print this out for students so they would have it in front of them, and we can't necessarily do that so well. But one thing I might draw our attention to is the date that she sent the letter and the date she wanted the revision. Concern about how the topic would be received, notes Michael. Asking him to edit down. Alicia. Yes. Yeah. And you can see she sent the letter out on August 5th. And she says, I don't even want to try to rush you, but I'd like to get your revision in final form well before you leave on vacation in September. So a lot of times students will kind of laugh at this and go like, oh my gosh, like that is quite, quite a quick turnaround, you know? So I think that, Amy's mentioning, I like the prioritizing of the tasks and the thought work. There was also a lesson in audience awareness here. Amy, do you want to say more about that? Yeah, could you go back to the letter near the bottom? Yeah, oops, I'm sorry. Where she's talking about getting it past the adults who buy the books. She highlights the book's readability, says Stephanie, one swift gulp. Yep, I love that as well. She says she wants to drop everything so she can read it as soon as it's ready, right? So I'm going to just transition to sharing a few other things that I noticed reading this. One is that she kind of isn't sure he has even read her marginal comments. So if we look at like, and I'm trying to find it here on the screen, but at some point she says something like, oh, right at the end of the third paragraph, like last 2 lines up from the end, I put complimentary remarks in the margins too, as I hope you noticed. So there's like a little hint here, like maybe this is just like languishing on your desk right now. And clearly the project was difficult to write. There's something difficult going on, and she's trying to sort of reinvigorate his writing process here. And kind of getting to what was said about the audience awareness comment, I think that was Amy. There's also a way that she's trying to appeal to this value of the book for young readers. She's trying to kind of call out a mission for the book. Okay, so we're going to transition now to something that may be familiar for us, but it is not to most undergraduate students. And this is something I do share with them. We share with them just like this. We are going to take a peek at some of John Bean's advice for providing feedback to writers. And this is advice that we might tell students. This is for teachers. This is trying to teach us how to respond to your writing. And where do we see Nordstrom doing what John Bean is talking about? Where do we see her doing what John Bean is talking about? So I'm going to just leave this up. I hope you can see the slide. I know it's hard, but any kind of like moments of connection that you guys want to drop into the chat would be wonderful, or just shout out. One thing we can do is to look at his general procedures and principles and ask Does she do it? Does she make positive comments or praise strong points? Being able to see her, Stephanie notes, being able to see her comments on the manuscript might be helpful. What were the passages where she wanted to make David's feelings clearer? That's true. That's true. Although what we might notice is that she doesn't get into the weeds so much in this note to him. Maybe because she doesn't want to overcomment. She wants to drive him back into the paper. You might remember Donald Murray's comment, a good writing conference is one that gets the student to revise. Maybe she's doing something like that here. Michael notes that her commentary is kind of a personal correspondence. Well, literally a personal correspondence, yes. Yeah. Do we sense that she is interested in the writer's ideas? Very much, says Alicia. The tone shows interest. The end comment in the letter is great. She emphasizes that the writing will mean something to the readers. Maybe that's like an end comment we do to students. She's praising, says Rebecca. The well-written, the school stuff is good. The friendship with the boy on the bus. I actually just read the novel that comes from this summer, and I love the friendship with the boy on the bus. I think she was so right about that. Well, I will reveal. I will reveal. It's called I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip. Even when pointing out the areas where revision is needed, the comments are about the hope that it will be better. Oh, one thing we haven't commented on is the further principle number 2. Whenever possible, use one-on-one conferencing instead of commenting on papers. And sometimes students will notice they had a lunch and she's referencing the lunch. It's like she communicated something in the lunch that she wants him to think about again. And that might feel relatable to teaching too, where you can just have those moments in conference that maybe are more expansive than something that can happen in a margin. Number 4, which is avoiding over commenting, is reflected in her final talk needs work, and we can talk more about this. So she avoids going on and on. Would anyone like to give a last word here before? Okay. I will say that most of what we've noticed here is noticed by students who do this. These are not, really difficult things to pick up on. And yeah, she's straightforward about this expected revision time. And so there's something about this that's unearthing things that are going on in feedback that are not necessarily right there on the surface. We can see more in Nordstrom's letter when we look at it through John Bean's principles. So some of the things that I talk about with students after doing this is just that feedback cycles are not limited to the classroom. They happen in all of these contexts, and they have a strong emotional and relational element that Nordstrom is using here to her advantage. The feedback is dialogic, is one of the words that already came up for us earlier. And that's similar to what a lot of teachers want students to be doing when they receive feedback. So, do we think that students often receive feedback like this? Do we think this feedback would have been effective? Am I missing a slide, you guys? Am I okay? Yeah, okay. So this is the book that emerged from this exchange. I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip. And it is widely acknowledged and credited as being the first YA book to explore a romantic relationship between two boys. The boys are 13 in the book, and it is still in print, 40 years after its original publication in 1969. Kathleen Horning, a specialist in the field of children's literature, notes that the book is really special because it serves as a bridge rather than a barrier for students, kids questioning their sexual identity.
Thank you, Kelly. So up until now, we've argued up until this point that framing feedback more expansively is important to help students develop a disposition to think across the drafts rather than viewing each instance of feedback as an island. Now we are going to switch gears and speak about the value of this work from our disciplinary islands, if you will: speech, writing, nursing, and math. And I will start us off coming from the perspective of speech. So, to whom much has been given, much is expected. This quote came into my mind when I first read Nancy Summers' article, Across the Drafts. In it, she describes how teachers often feel a weighty responsibility when responding to our students' words, knowing that we too have received comments that have given us hope and sometimes made us despair in our abilities as writers, and I would add as speakers as well. In the time that I've been teaching, many things have changed, but one thing remains the same for me as it did when I began in 1999. Thank you. Yeah, we can leave it on there, and then I'll let you know when to switch to the next one. And that is that I too feel an incredible weighty responsibility when it comes to my students' work and responding to my students' work. So my name is Julee Rosser, and I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I work in the overlapping disciplines of adult education, women's and gender studies, African and African American studies, and communication studies. In our time together today, I will focus on my communication classes, and more specifically, public speaking. I am so excited to share this process that I'm using to help my students have the best speaking experience ever. So I will share with you how I am applying these concepts from Summers' article and John Bean's book, Engaging Ideas, to the design of the class and the feedback I give students. With these changes, I am hoping to create a classroom where students see themselves as valuable speakers with something important to say. So will you flip to the next slide? To start off, the process for me is currently in motion as I am working right now on changes for my class that starts in a few weeks. Traditionally, I assign 4 speeches: a self-introduction speech, an informative speech, a persuasive speech, and a ceremonial speech. And I use a rubric to assign points to the speeches, and I write short comments in the feedback section. The problem I notice is that the students don't always read my feedback, right? And if they did, they didn't apply the information to their next speech. So I asked myself, why wouldn't they read and apply the feedback I give them? After some time, I realized that students don't read feedback if they don't value the assignment. So ask myself the question, how can I build speech assignments so that they will value them? And how can I get them to care when many of them are working days and doing school on nights and weekends and then caring for their families? How can I get them to care? Well, Summers tells us about the Harvard research study of students and their experiences. And she said, when students were asked about their best writing experiences, that there were 2 components that stood out. One was that they involved the opportunity to write about something that matters to them, and then the opportunity to engage with an instructor through feedback. So she said, with a thoughtful reader, the whole process is enriched, deepened, and inscribed in memory. And I would say, with a thoughtful listener, the same would be true, that it would be, the whole process would be enriched, deepened, and inscribed in memory. So I want to focus on the first component for now, where students write about something that matters to them. The question I asked was, how can I make this matter more to them? What if I could help them to see a connection between the speeches? So instead of having islands of speeches where each one was distinct, they could see the connection with them. Like Kelly talked about at the beginning of this talk, how can we inspire students to see the pattern? Well, maybe I could start by creating a connecting theme or pattern in the speech design so that they can in turn see the pattern in their development more clearly. So that's what I'm doing. I will link the speeches together through their identity. That's a linking factor. I will ask them to begin by describing themselves and their self-introduction speech by including what they know about themselves, their world, and what they care about the most. This speech will be a foundational speech, where before it was just like the first speech that they would do just to kind of get comfortable. But it will be a foundational speech, one that the informative and the persuasive speeches come from. For example, in her self-introduction speech, Jacqueline shares a love of horses. She decides to use that love of horses to inform her audience about the ways to ride horses in her informative speech. And then for her persuasive speech, she decides to encourage the audience to support a rescue for horses, for like a nonprofit organization. So you see how they are now linked together. Okay, so for this connection to be strong, there must be time in the beginning for self-reflection. Instead of jumping straight into the first speech, time is also needed for self-reflection in between each speech. So for students to get a chance to decide on what topics and how they're going to take them. So time is an important thing to recognize here, and building time into the process connects these three speeches. But let's put that on the shelf for just a minute, and I'll come back to it. So after deciding, will you flip it back to the next one, or the one before, Markus? Thank you. So after deciding on a way to help students speak, or Kelly, that's you, right? Sorry. After deciding on a way to help students speak about something that matters to them, I moved my focus to the second component, where students say that their best writing experience involves an opportunity to engage with their instructor through feedback. So Summers describes feedback as something that plays a leading role in undergraduate writing only when the student and teacher create a partnership through feedback, where teachers engage their students as apprentices, apprentice scholars, offering honest critique paired with instruction. Okay, so let's keep that in mind, that we engage with them as apprentices. And then John Bean tells us, as you remember back to the ideas that we were just talking about, engaging with Ursula Nordstrom's letter to John Donovan. He says we need to comment on ideas and organization, make positive comments by praising strong points, show some interest in student ideas, avoid over-commenting, indicate reactions to specific passages, be legible, use one-on-one conferences when possible, and think of commentary as personal correspondence with the tone of a supporting coach. That's great. Okay, Kelly, will you flip to the next slide? And here's where I come back to the concept of time. So in order to, let's think about this. In my process of considering how I can prepare my students to receive feedback from me, I think about how I can create the space in my life to be able to work with students more closely. We must build in time to give and for the give and take feedback process, especially if we are to treat students as apprentices. So I would say each of us has our own concerns about time, right? We have heard, that we can only say yes to the things that bring us joy. And that we can also, many of us have been told that no is a statement just by itself, right? And self-care is essential. And at some point, I would love to give a whole talk on maybe at the next IWAC conference, like a whole talk on how to mindfully create space in our busy lives for the things that we care about. But for now, I'll just focus on what I'm doing in this one class to create space to help my students have the best speaking experience ever. So I spoke with one of my former students who is an instructional designer now, and she encouraged me to teach less better. Teach less better. So with this in mind, I decided to experiment this fall with a course design that only includes 3 connected speeches instead of 4 distinctly different ones, where in this one, feedback time is built into the process. Okay, let's go ahead and switch to the final slide. It is my hope that this will help students see the pattern of their own development, seeing themselves as evolving apprentice speakers, hopefully living up to the idea that my comments will, in Summer's words, straddle the present world of the speech at hand with a glance to the next speech, articulating one lesson for the future. So as I bring my presentation to a close, I would like to return to the concept that I introduced in the beginning. To whom much has been given, much is expected. I have had exceptional teachers in my life, so I am excited for this chance to enhance my students' opportunities to have the best speaking experience ever. I feel confident in my ability to carry the weighty responsibility of responding to my students' words now that there is more time built into the course. And hopefully these efforts will help students to see themselves as valuable speakers with something important to say. Thank you for your attention, everyone. And so now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Kelly Blewett, who is going to share some insights about how to get students open to seeing feedback as a learning opportunity.
Okay, so I'm coming at this from my perspective as a teacher of writing and the writing program administrator. And I just wanted to share that the Nordstrom activity is something I brought to our WAC group in an effort to sort of talk about the idea that there are principles that underlie feedback across the curriculum. And I think that can be really surprising to students. And it was something that really kind of brought us together. And as you're seeing, really made us all think about our own practices as they connect to these foundational ideas about feedback. And when I use Nordstrom's letter in my class, I specifically try to prime students for the kind of feedback that they can get on their writing from me, but also try to show that that approach to feedback is something that's bigger and more expansive than my writing classroom. So another document that I give to students kind of as a follow-up, and I want to share this with you, I'm just showing you the top part of this, are 2 letters that I wrote to students several years ago. And one was a really strong paper, and the other was a paper that was had a low C, is how I put it here on the right-hand side of the slide. But understanding that you need a C to pass first year writing at the institution where I taught, this is a paper that's really kind of like on the fence of not passing. And the purpose of showing students these 2 letters side by side immediately following Nordstrom is to just point out, hey, look, everyone's getting praise and critique. Everyone's getting the same kind of principles underlying the feedback that they give, and that I'm going to give you, and you can expect to see these kinds of letters from me. And I hope that this is something that you can receive. And what does it mean to kind of receive it? And I also use this as a kind of prime for peer review. I love Richard Straub's essay about how to really respond to someone's writing. So I've used that as well. But I think they really work well together to encourage students to have an unabashedly personal response to where they felt themselves moved by the essay. And that's something that can be very, very exciting for a student writer to hear. And something that I try to emulate in my own comments, as you can see here. What a fun essay to read, the personal narrative and the artfulness that you used, parts of your essay sing. So there's always specific things to praise. And that's something I hope students get from this. And looking at the quotes that we introduced earlier, the one here on the right, that Summers is talking about, an ability to be open to critical feedback is so important dispositionally for students across college that I have been thinking about how do we sort of bake that in to the conversations that we have in first year writing. And with that, I'll turn it over to our nursing faculty member, Carolyn Judd.
Thank you, Kelly. For the next couple of minutes, I invite you into the mind of a nurse, a student nurse, and nurse educator. So enjoy. Why do we as nurses write? The following statements are just a few of the reasons why it is important that nurses write and write well. We write to be better communicators. We write because what we write can mean literally the difference between life and death. We write to present ourselves professionally as the world's most trusted profession. We write to change health policy and communicate our message to those tasked with making changes. We write to change the way nurses practice nursing. We write to teach and make better versions of ourselves and our students. And that is why our feedback is so important. Next slide. So much has been written about nurses leaving the nursing profession, and most of it is due to burnout. The number this past year is staggering, nearly 80,000 nurses leaving the profession. With the next generation of boomer nurses retiring, it's just imperative that we make an even greater effort to retain the nurses who are entering the field. And part of the solution lies in the mentoring of new nurses by the seasoned nurses they will replace. And this mentoring relationship naturally occurs on the clinic floor and in hospital and community settings with teach-back demonstrations and verbal feedback through debriefing, but it should also occur in the classroom in writing activities. The following is the SMART goal activity that is threaded through the curriculum of a nursing program that takes the student on a journey of self-care and growth as a student nurse. So our goal is to teach nursing students that self-care starts in nursing school and should continue throughout their career. And as students move through the junior and senior year, the SMART goals become more specific and divided between what students hope to accomplish in the course and personal wellness goals. So Kelly, if you could just advance that and we can review what a SMART goal is. I'm sure that everyone is familiar, that it's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And we can advance the slide and see what our senior level nursing student came up with for a goal. The example provided is an entering senior nursing student writing a SMART goal for an upcoming clinical immersion trip to an inner city or urban setting, coming from a rural setting, okay? So the student writes, I will be a more culturally well-rounded person by the end of the immersion trip. So Kelly, advance. The original assignment was for the student to write 5 SMART goals, but this is just one example of the goals that were written. The goal, the feedback is written in red, as you see. So take a moment to read both of those together and see what you think. The result of the feedback, as Summers suggests, is developing a partnership with the student, which in this case is much like a nurse will develop with a patient. So keep in mind that even though the focus has changed from all self-care goals in the sophomore year to a clinical immersion experience in the senior year, the concept of a SMART goal did not change. The initial feedback given asked the student to examine what it means to be a culturally well-rounded person. Examine if that is achievable in this trip, and then determine how to measure it. So it was back to the drawing board for revision. And this is where faculty is instrumental in assisting students to reconnect those dots and to carry that thread forward through the nursing program. Next slide. So here's the revision of the SMART goal that originally stated, I will be a more culturally well-rounded person by the end of the immersion trip. Kelly, advance. All right. So take a moment to read the revised feedback and the revised goal. And while the revised goal may appear to be an entirely new goal, the feedback argues that the student was in fact able to realize the original intent of her goal. As we looked at the feedback offered to this student, how many comments reflect the general feedback principles that John Bean suggests? Principles such as being straightforward in the comments, being available for students to meet and discuss the assignment, which was written in the first feedback cycle, being personable and supportive with correspondence, much like a coach or a nurse mentor. And finally, making positive comments and praising strong points to enhance partnership. Next slide. So as our students teach us, their papers don't end when they turn them in for a grade, nor do our comments end when we write them. The partnership between writer and reader, between student and teacher, and I would even assert between student nurse and seasoned nurse, creates something new, a collection of ideas that are larger than the paper itself, ideas milling around, moving forth into the world across drafts. Thank you.
Right, and I'm Markus Pomper, and I teach the scary subject, namely math. And I realized this is a writing conference, right? So why do we need to write in math? And after all, math looks like this, right? Any math always looks like something that's here. So a few myths that I'd like to dispel is the first one is that math is just about symbols, similar to what we see on this slide here. But really the truth is that math uses symbols in sentences in order to establish meaning. So a symbol by itself usually doesn't mean all that much, or an equation by itself. You need to give it context, and you usually do that with a sentence. And my second myth is that math is just about numbers and computations. So this is something that we often encounter, students saying is like, oh, I'm good with numbers, so I must be good with math. And that's not really the case, because math is more about formal reasoning, right? It's about using possibly computations, not always, but sometimes use computations in order to make an argument or to make a proof. And that gets me to the next myth, namely the dreaded concept of the proof in mathematics. Many students come to me and say, oh, I'm just not good at writing proofs. So they think it's an innate skill, a skill that you're born with and you can do, or if you can't do it, you might as well give up. And the fact is, proof writing is a skill that can be learned, and it's something that can be proved upon and can be perfected. And since I teach in the upper part of the math program, I want to talk about writing proofs in mathematics. So if you look at the next slide, the math curriculum typically is structured into the first, second year, where the students encounter calculus and linear algebra and differential equations. And those are all courses that are largely based on computational aspects of math, right? So you follow a certain algorithm to get a certain result, and that's your numerically answer at the end, and you're good. Whereas the junior, senior level math they fall into two categories: pure math and applied math. And I don't want to go into too much of the distinction here, but what they have in common is that they all require us to either present a proof, which would be the pure math courses, or to apply a justification why a chosen method is appropriate for a given problem. So my talk here my part of the presentation will look at how I can give feedback in courses in pure math and help students how to become better proof writers. So let's look at an example here. A typical example in a course that's called Bridge to Abstract Math is the following: is to prove that the sum of any two even integers is again an even integer. And don't be scared, right? I'll help you in a moment. And an integer, first of all, is a whole number, right? So it's like 1 or 15 or negative 254. So any whole number is an integer. And an integer, we say, is even if it's divisible by 2. Or if you write that formally, we use what's called a definition. would be stated in the following way. An integer n is even if it can be written of the form 2 times k, where k is an other integer. So the formal way to write this is if an integer n is even if there exists an other integer k, so that n is equal to 2k. Now let's have a look at the proof. Oh, not so fast, Kelly, not so fast. All right, so we want to show that the sum of two even integers is an even integer. So we begin by naming those two integers. We suppose that m and n are two even integers. And then we apply our definition, which is in the last line that we see here. Namely, we can conclude that there exist integers k and l, so that m is equal to 2k and n is equal to 2l. All right, and then we get to looking at the sum of the two, m and n. So m plus n, that's the sum of m and n, is then 2k plus 2l, and we can use a little bit of algebra to factor out a 2. This is equal to 2 times k plus l. And then the conclusion is in the last sentence that k plus l must be an integer, and therefore 2 times k plus l, and therefore m plus n is again an even integer, which is the objective of this proof. And we end this proof by a little square box. It just indicates to a mathematician that the proof is over, that it's done with. All right, so this is what the correct proof should look like. And of course, in math, we get tons and tons and tons of proofs that are not correct. So let's have a look at a few of those. So proof number one, student number one, writes the following: m plus n is equal to 2k plus 2l, which is 2 times k plus l, comma, even. All right, so let's go back for that a little bit, Kelly. From this proof, if you look at it, the student is clearly informed by what's happening in the lower level math courses, right? So what's important to the student is adding two integers, m plus n, and doing some algebraic manipulation, and the word comma even, that's almost an afterthought of that, right? So the beginning and the end of the proof is really missing. Let's look at proof number two. Okay, so this student says, well, if you have two whole numbers that are divisible by 2, you add them, then the result is divisible by 2. So what's wrong here is that the student doesn't use the definition, and the proof is not really correct. And let's look at proof number 3. I get that a lot too. Here it is. All right, so this student obviously just doesn't even know where to start. So one way to give feedback to that is not what I recommend, but let's see what one way of giving feedback is. The following: to write snarky comments, preferably in red, and maybe even circle something at random in there, which I have refrained from doing. But really, this feedback doesn't help our student. Oh, go back. This feedback doesn't really help our student, because on proof number 1, the student wouldn't know what is incomplete, what's missing, right? All the important things are there, right? Why is number 2 wrong? I wouldn't know. And student number 3, I'm pretty sure that student number 3 knows that the proof is missing, right? I'm going out on a limb here, so not really helpful comments. Let's look at some other way to give comments, Kelly. Okay, we can give grades, right? So the first proof is correct. Second, proof number 1 can be salvaged somewhat, probably. Proof number 2 needs a whole lot of revision. So probably a D, and if there's nothing to comment on, an F is probably appropriate. But again, this doesn't really help the student. So none of those proofs spell doom for a math student, right? So if I get any of those proofs in week 2 of the junior year, nothing is lost, right? So the student can still learn how to write a proof, right? So if I get this in week 2 of the semester, I'm not worried because there are another 12 weeks to go. Now, the question is, how can we get the student in those remaining 12 weeks of the semester to improve on those proofs? What can we tell them to do differently? All right, let's look at the next slide, Kelly. All right, so let's look at one of them. And I could decide to give this type of feedback here, right? So I can tell the student, well, it's a C, right? It needs some work, but here's what you should do. You want to start, by framing what m and n are. You could tell the reader, those are the two integers that I mentioned in the statement of our problem. And then you could explain that they're both even, and you can find your integers k and l. so that m is equal to 2k and n is equal to 2l. And then make sure you keep the things that are correct, right? So this algebraic manipulation that the student provides here is correct, that needs to stay. And you need to tell the student, this is good, you want to keep that, right? So here's a way to write feedback to the student. If the student incorporates all of that, this proof isn't perfect, right? But it's a good step closer to where we need to be. Now, what I noticed is, even though I give feedback, whoa, the student focuses on the fact that it's C, or it's like whatever, 5 out of 10 points or whatever, right? They don't really take that feedback to heart. And I run the risk of, in week 14 of the semester, still have a proof that looks like that, even though I went through all that pain of writing all that feedback. So what I've done instead, now we get to our next slide, is not only give the feedback, but also require the student to revise what they have. So the student then is supposed to hand in a second draft of their homework assignment that incorporates those revisions. All right, so starts with what we already have and works with that and works with my feedback to make it better. So what is important to me here is that these second draft assignments are not another shot at the same problem. It's an improvement of what the student already has. So let's look at the next slide. Here's the one comment that stood out to me in our reading as we were preparing for this, right? So comments function to anchor students in their academic lives and ultimately make a vast difference in their college writing, and looking at students as apprentice writers. So what I see myself as doing when I give this feedback to the students in their homework assignment week after week after week is I think myself of a journal editor. Right? If I write a paper in mathematics and send it to a journal, after a while I get it back with comments that an editor has written. And the editor will write, these are good things, but you want to rearrange it in some way, or you want to, this is not quite clear to me, why is this the case? And I use that in order to revise my paper and submit it hopefully for publication. So in a sense, I'm doing the same thing to our students here. I'm treating them as apprentice mathematicians and tell them how to use feedback on their proofs in order to improve on their writing. All right, and we have one last activity for all of us. Kelly?
So we began the presentation showing you all these quotes, and we would just love to hear from you. What stands out to you now? What do you notice? And I know that we only have 2 minutes left, but we all were just so eager to share with you and to go through this demonstration with you. So if you want to respond in the chat or just call out, we would love to hear from you.
Not all at once.
I was just thinking about the comment on the right and the importance of having openness and receptivity to comments. One of the things that I start my semesters with now is just a little bit of a talk about fixed mindset versus growth mindset, and have the students think a little bit about, you know, how I receive that feedback. What I do in this course really depends on what my mindset is, and that's what that reminds me of, encouraging them to be open.
Oh, I really like that.
Thank you guys for coming to this panel. We really are thrilled to have so many people with us. Thank you.